Being a Better Dungeon Master, Series 1. One of the things I found in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so is the idea of role-playing has really kind of disappeared as an art. I've seen a lot of computer RPGs come along, and in reality, the art of a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons or Rifts or GURPS or things of that nature really have kind of been lost as an art, as a craft. And after about, well, I don't know, 17 years, 18-year hiatus, I really kind of felt I owed it to the younger generation to kind of try to preserve a bit of that technique and that artistry that went into role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and things of that nature, and what really went into the craft of it. And what I decided to do is I was going to do a video series to kind of cover some of that and try to preserve what I knew of the craft and what was taught to me and what I learned over the years back in the day when we were doing a lot of role-playing. And for the most part, I was always the dungeon master. It was very rare that I got to be the player. So I ended up having to do it quite often and developed some techniques and some rules and things that kind of conveyed into that. And that's what's going to go into this series, is to try to, preserve some of that for posterity, if anything else. And the original idea behind this recording is I tend to do a lot of meetings and things like that, so my skill set is more with presentations than doing cute videos with animation and stuff like that. So I'm just going to run this kind of like a presentation, almost like a TED discussion, and then perhaps at a later date and time someone can overlay this with some kind of animation or something instead of just a bunch of needless slides if somebody wants to put it into syndication or something to that degree. But with that aside and an explanation of what we're going to go through here, a couple words of disclosure is that I do not intend this to be, a definitive, this is how it should be. This is just an extract of my experiences, and you should take it as opinion. Again, often in life we're always told opinions are like assholes, everybody's got one, and it's usually full of shit. So do not take it too seriously. People should have their own opinions, and they're going to disagree and agree with a lot of this. And part of this grew out of the fact that I've observed that most kids today are almost bankrupt in the area of imagination. They need everything spelled out for them. And I have to blame computers and televisions and movies for a lot of that, because the audio, the visual, everything is provided for them, so they don't have to stretch their imagination enough. And people who are big fans of books versus films understand this argument. You're never going to convince somebody that's not a big fan of books on what they're missing. And it's just, it's sad in one sense, but it is what it is. Part of the problem is that a book gives you a lot of freedom. The downfall of that is that puts a lot of responsibility on the individual to have a good imagination to begin with. And a lot of people don't. Especially kids who are raised on a television set, and rather than raised on books, is that you never develop the theater of your own mind enough to really handle it and cope with it. So there's going to be a pair of generations that are going to probably be insulted by that, but it's my observation, and it's impacting a lot of different things. It impacts your critical thinking skills and your problem-solving skills. And I'll give you a great story of how this plays out. So I was a contractor working for a lighting company, and we were putting in a data center. And we were getting, I believe, they were Dell, and I think they were 2U rack units. And we had 2 racks, and everything was in, and for the most part, but they were going to be delivering everything at about, if memory serves me right, it was about 2:30 that the deliveries were going to come in. The guy that was working on the locks on the door wasn't going to be in until like 4. So all that we needed to do is to, keep the door open, and the delivery guys were going to bring all the machines in and get them put in the lab, and then we could close the door and lock the door, and then everything would be safe and secure in there, and life would be good. Guy comes, set up the door, gets it opened up, and then we can, open and close it, lock it and unlock it. Well, the boss's son ends up having to work with me, and I have a meeting with his dad, and I have to go. And I tell the brilliant kid, apparently, Harvard grad. They can't say that enough. That this is the best and the brightest that the nation has to offer. And I'm like, okay, well, when the Dell guys get here, and we'll keep the door propped open, and because he was in the lab, so he could open the door from the inside. I'm like, just when they get here, prop the door open. They'll bring all the racks in, and then close the door behind you. And then when the lock guy comes in, we'll get that addressed with the card reader and all that stuff. So I go to the meeting. I come back after the meeting, and I find 87 boxes stacked outside the server room. Outside, not inside. And there's a publicly accessible area. Anybody walking by could just have picked up one of those boxes. And I get Junior, and I'm like, why are all the boxes out here? And he's like, well, I couldn't prop the door open. I said, well, why couldn't you prop the door open? He says, I couldn't find a doorstop. Now, I want you to think about this, people. It is actually as dumb as it sounds. I looked at him and I just said, well, why wouldn't you just prop the door open with one of the boxes and then let all the other boxes in? And his response was, that's not the right tool for the job. This is what I mean by a bankruptcy in imagination and how it impacts problem solving, is that every detail has to be provided. There's a right answer for everything and a very specific tool for everything, and it would never occur to them to be imaginative and just use something heavy to keep the door open. This is a problem that I've encountered in almost 18 years of a career now, is I've seen in the last 2 generations, the tail end of my generation, a profound level of stupidity. And part of that comes in the ability to have an imagination, to think outside the box. But it's a real problem. And when I go to my comic book store, or your bookstore, and you see people with RPGs and how they play, and even things that you see at like cons of sorts, Dragon Con and different game cons, and how they sit and how they approach a role-playing game, I see the problem as clear as day. And I only can describe it as a bankruptcy of imagination. And part of it is television, part of it is video games in general, where every detail is provided, where every sound, every texture, nothing is left to the imagination anymore. And that impacts your critical thinking skills, because it takes a certain degree of imagination to innovate and to think of different solutions to a problem. And to the fact that you can't prop open a door because you can't find a doorstop shows me that you've become so narrow-minded and deterministic in how you think that the imagination goes right out the window. I mean, even fundamental thought process of, well, what's the purpose and function of a doorstop is just something heavy to keep a door from closing. I mean, that should have been just apparent, something heavy. Phone book, a couple phone books. Yeah, we had phone books back then. And again, this person graduated college somehow. An expensive one at that. But I'm just thinking, it can't be the education problem. You can't fault education, because education is a deterministic system anyway. This is the right answer, and you need to come up with the right answer, and that's that, but what's missing, and the imagination is the key. And that's why books, I don't think, will ever go away. 1,000,000 years from now, 100 million years, it won't be holodecks that people will be clinging to. They'll still be reading books, because books give people freedom. Freedom to imagine the scene as they see fit. And it's a concept that I guess I would call self-referential cohesion. In the theater of your mind, when you envision a scene, everything makes sense in it. It's rational in your own mind. There are no loose ends or things that don't make sense in the scene. And every detail that you give someone impacts that on the negative. So books give you much more flexibility to determine what Harry Potter looks like, where everybody is standing in the scene. When books get too detailed, I'm talking to you, Song of Fire and Ice, George Martin. Well, anyways, you're robbing people of the opportunity to fill in the blanks themselves. And we see this all the time in good horror and bad horror, and the idea of, you know, what makes a good suspenseful story. It's not necessarily the stuff that you see, it's what you can't see. And your subconscious and your mind fills in the gaps. It's not about seeing the guy getting bludgeoned with a hammer. It's when it happens off screen, then you can fill in the blanks on just how bad it actually comes out. So part of that philosophy goes into being a better dungeon master. But we really kind of go over the basics, and this is just the intro video to kind of tell you where we're going to go with this eventually, and kind of give you an idea of what our objective is. And that's just to sit down with a group of friends, you know, 1 to 5. I really don't recommend going more than 5 people at a time, and having a good time playing a role-playing game, an actual role-playing game, not a strategy game, not chess with a bunch of extra rules, but a role-playing game, and we're going to get to that. So first thing is what is the dungeon master? And the dungeon master is kind of part referee, part storyteller, and part narrator, and there is a difference between those last two that we're going to cover here in a second. The players is everyone else. The referee part of a DM is you are going to pick a role-playing game system. For the sake of this video, we're just going to discuss Dungeons and Dragons because it's one of the more popular ones. But there's also Palladium and GURPS and Rollmaster, or as a lot of people call it, Chartmaster. And a lot of them are out of print, and it's a dying art. It really is. And it's unfortunate, but maybe in this little tidbit we can preserve some of the artistry of that. And as the DM, you need to know the rules. And you'll hear the term Game Master or GM, and it's the same as Dungeon Master. It's basically, we're going to use the term DM and Dungeon Master largely, but I'll throw in a Game Master or a GM periodically just for shits and giggles. But regardless of what rule system you pick, ultimately the Dungeon Master is the rules. He makes the rules. He is the rule. What he says goes, and there's a purpose for that. The RPG system that you pick is more or less a guideline to get everybody on the same page. And the story that's always used in role-playing games in general is the idea of cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, stuff like that. Two kids are in the playground, and they're playing cops and robbers, and he says, "I shot you," and the other kid says, "No, you didn't." This is where a role-playing game system is born. And you say, well, let's flip a quarter. If it's heads, I gotcha. If it's tails, I didn't. And that's a 1d2, one roll of a 2-sided die. And you'll hear that term a lot of times, like 1d6 is one roll of a 6-sided die. Now, in the computer world, we can have impossible dice. We can have a 1d3. That really geometrically doesn't work very well. Usually they're an even number sides, but occasionally they try to sneak that in. But like a good example is a prime number. You're not going to see a lot of prime number dice. It's tricky. I've seen artisans create them, but they're not very arbitrary or equal. They tend to have a bias to them. But the idea of being the referee is to help resolve conflicts, not between the DM and the player. Most conflicts are between the player and what the player wants to do. It's not, the DM and the players are not adversaries. A lot of people make that mistake. The adversary is the player. I want to do 3 somersaults and cut the guy's ponytail off like a bad kung fu film. That's what I want to do. Okay, well, here's how difficult it is. It's the player versus what the player desires to do. The DM shouldn't care less whether he succeeds or fails. The players are going to set the tone, and the players are going to be struggling against what they think they can do. The DM is just there to help them resolve the did I succeed or not. The storyteller is another big part, and that is that the dungeon master in general is part writer, part director, and he plays all the bit parts in the movie, so to speak. The DM provides the story, the plot that drives it. There's two levels. There's an adventure and there's a campaign. A campaign is a collection of adventures. And in the old days, we used to call adventures gazettes. Basically a small adventure, 2 to 4 hours to play through for a specific level of character. And the campaign is that persistence between adventures. You would start a campaign at level 1, and then you'd play an adventure that's level 1 to 2, and then you might play another adventure that's level 3 to 5, and so forth and so forth. So the campaign is like a big bucket full of golf balls, and each golf ball is an adventure. And the adventure has a level range. Now, as a dungeon master, you're going to create a campaign usually, and then you're going to fill it in with adventures. So you have the big campaign level plot, which is usually, save the world from some evil of some sort. And then you have the little adventures that kind of carry them through, like episodes of a TV series. The dungeon master, though, he only provides a skeleton. You don't want to get too specific, even in your campaign or in your adventure, because the players are going to fill in all the gaps. Remember, we go back to this, and we're going to get to this again later, is that every detail you give the player is one less than they can imagine. So, being a dungeon master is a very different skill set for writing. You can be a good dungeon master and a terrible author. And I should know I'm a terrible author. I spent so much time doing dungeon master stuff that I like to use the term interactive fiction specialist. You can't provide too tight of a story, because then you're depriving the player of the flexibility they need to have a good time. So the storyteller is different than the narrator. We're going to cover that in our next little slide here, but think of it this way. The storyteller pushes information to players. It's that pushed information that goes to the player. The narrator is something very different. The narrator is not the same as the storyteller, but the narrator is the intermediary between the world and the player to provide information. I've pushed the story to them already. Let's say it's a story about rescuing a little girl's kidnapped mom from a group of orcs. Okay, that's the storyteller. The narrator has to cope with the fact that the players decide, well, let's build a firewall around the entire orc encampment and then keep pushing the fire in towards them. Then sneak in while the fire is raging and get the mother out of the camp while the orcs are trying not to get burned alive. The narrator has to respond to that and then give them the information based on what the players are saying. The player says, what does the cauldron in the middle of the orc encampment look like? That's not a story element. You didn't write anything about it. You didn't plan on them caring about the cauldron. So the narrator has to be fast on his feet and describes things to the players. Versus the story, which is this crafted kind of literary composition, the narrator is that abstract, disembodied voice that says, as you peer around the corner, you see down the long alleyway a cloaked figure. Now, the narrator and the story, they overlap there. I'm trying to explain to them that there's some shady figure down the hallway. But the player might say, well, what kind of shoes is he wearing? Then I have to say, as you peer down to his feet, you notice that the woven sandals have small flecks of silver thread in them. The narrator is that disembodied voice that conveys information. The storyteller tells a story. The narrator conveys information, basically in response to what the players ask. And there's two different skill sets for that. The story is easy. You know what the story is. You wrote it. The narrator, fast on your feet and providing information. And quite frankly, in a perfect world, the narrator would probably either be James Earl Jones, Morgan Freeman, or that dude that always does the BBC narrations, whose name I can never remember. Now, what kind of DM are you? Well, the Dungeon Master is a combination of all three of those qualities, and they're going to fall somewhere in that middle. You can be more of a referee, aka the rule monger. You can be more the narrator, which is the fast and play it loose type, and the storyteller, which is much more narrative driven. And your RPG system influences that. If you're in White Wolf's system for storytelling, like Vampire the Masquerade, it's much more storytelling driven. If you're in Dungeons and Dragons, you're more towards the referee neck of the woods. The narrator, I would say probably, if there was a role-playing system that really kind of leaned on the narrator, I would probably say Palladium, which is used in Rifts and Robotech and Ninjas and Super Spies. But those kind of things kind of are gonna help shape and how this. But this brings me to the golden rules, and this is where we're gonna bring this particular video to a close. Is that we're gonna develop a video for each one of these bullet points, and the golden rules are thus, and very briefly: ensure that you know your players and understand the element of trust. If your players are working in an adversarial version, in an adversarial way in your campaign, then you're not going to have a very good time. They're always going to be working against you. If you're an adversary with your DM, you're doing it wrong. Every detail you give a player is one less than they can imagine on their own. And this is very important because you can over-explain things. You can overrun things. You can over-regulate things. You can focus too much on the rules and not enough on the story. The third bullet point is a difficult one for a lot of people. The rules exist largely to resolve conflicts and add drama. They don't drive the story. You don't use the rule mechanics or rely on the rule mechanics to provide a plot point. The reason is because they're supposed to be arbitrary. You don't have control over them that much. If you start bending the rules for the sake of the story, you're going to lose trust. Fourth bullet point, which is the large core of role-playing, the purpose of role-playing games is to bring the character and the world to life. You need to focus on that and reward players for doing that, not just chopping up stuff on a little grid. If you want to do hack and slash, trust me, Path of Exile, Diablo, Torchlight, there are plenty of computer games that are much better implementations of that. Even Final Fantasy Tactics and Wakfu and all of those different things are much better way of having that type of gameplay played out than a role-playing game. The next bulletin point, the DM is always right, and this is important because the DM might ignore rules or break rules as necessary to ensure that A, the story moves along, B, the narration fits, and C, that the players are having a good time. It doesn't do you any good to have all the players die your first adventure. And we're going to get to that as well. The next one is never read to players. I can't stress this enough. This is a problem that we saw with gazettes in days back. When you read to players, it sounds like you're reading to them. It sounds literally like the old, there's plenty of YouTube videos of it, is it the Attack the Darkness moments. You are in a cave with 3 orcs surrounded by torchlight, and then your cadence, your pacing, everything that you describe sounds like you're reading, and it's distracting. Rather than have a paragraph description, just put literally 1 word, commas, of the things that are in the room that you want to cover, and then you just explain it to them. Don't read to them. You have a personality as a DM. Leverage it. Use it. But don't sit there and read to them. There are professionals for that do books on tape. You are not a professional book on tape person. If you are, you would make a very good DM. But don't read to them. If the orc is 8 feet tall, has a purple mohawk, brown loincloth, and is built like Lou Ferrigno, just write that just as I said it. Don't read it to them that way. And then you can just briefly scan it, and then however your personality and however you decide to do storytelling comes through. Then you can describe it in your own words. Unless you're a professional that deals with giving speeches a lot, there's classes and debate clubs and college level stuff on how to do that. You're not one of those people, so don't pretend to be one of them. Just keep the information bullet point wise, and then quickly in your head write it out. Just write it out as you tell them. Don't sit there and write this massive paragraph and then read it back to them word for word. It doesn't work. It never comes off that way. Unless you're a professional that's used to reading a script and reading dialogue like that, it's never going to come across the way that you want it to. Maps and figurines, I detest them. I don't like them. And people have all these online tools and online digital board game systems and all. You don't need it. You don't, because it detracts from good role-playing, and more importantly, it turns the suspension of disbelief into this weird, goofy strategy mechanic where you have figurines and everybody takes their turn. The fights don't work that way. Watch a boxing match. It's not Mike Tyson gets in the ring and he rolls initiative and he gets to throw a punch, and then the other guy gets to throw a punch, and they sit there and they have this kind of lockstep mechanic. It doesn't work that way. The idea of your actions in a particular moment is that's the moment where you do the extraordinary, not the ordinary. That's the highlights. You don't role play out the whole 6.5 minute fight. What you're doing is you're just picking moments of that fight that are exceptional, and that's what the players are doing. You're always assuming they're fighting. You're always assuming they're doing their thing. It's those highlights, those moments that stand out from the background. Damage in a game is not necessarily the result of the direct consequence of an action. Face it, if somebody swings a sword at you and they connect, you're probably going to die. Not take 6 hit points out of 12 and live to fight another day. So the idea is that the combat itself is born out of the idea that damage is somewhat abstract. It's not literally directly as a result of you hitting with a sword, hitting with a fireball. If a player wants to cast fireball and do 6 points of damage, okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the 6 points of damage is directly the result of the fireball. It could be he dodged out of the way of the fireball and ended up whacking his head against something. That's the problem with too much detail. And then the narrator, which if you look at the slide here, this is a good example of narrator versus storyteller. This is the narrator part coming into play. So the player says, I cast fireball and do 6 points of damage. Okay. Well, now, how did that 6 points of damage come about? Give them some information. But if everything's lockstepped, now what I'm doing is, okay, you do fireball, 6 points of damage. It's something out of the ordinary. Let's take just a moment, slice of that combat, and see what happened at that particular point in time. So while everybody else is beating each other up and stuff, this is your one moment, and you're going to do 6 points of damage. Fireball explodes from Daniel's hands, hurtles to the room. The Rye Orc leaps to the side and has his face have a brief romance with a stalagmite, breaking his nose in the process. Love hurts, they say, and the love between flesh and stone just wasn't meant to be. That's considerably more interesting to say, you hit and it's 6 points of damage, it looks hurt. Yeah, no. You have the opportunity, the DM, to provide them enough. The delicate balance is how much information do you provide. For some players, I may have given them too much information in that blurb that you see in the slide. For others, it might not be enough. It just depends on your players. And again, going up to the first rule, ensure that you know your players. That's a big part of it, is how much information they need. Players roll dice in action, DMs roll dice for reactions. Your players do not have to do a lot of dice rolling. If they're walking down a hallway and there's a trap, they don't have to roll the die to say if they succeeded in dodging the trap or not. When the player reacts, the DM should roll that die, not the player. Because I might want to fudge the roll just to make them succeed or fail for the sake of story or drama. Players, when they choose to do something, should always roll their own dice. Always. Because if anything's going to kill them, it's going to be their own actions, not the actions of a DM. Timing. Pause, stop, and breathe. No better rules. I kid you not. People are so hurried and want such immediate gratification now that they want everything boom, 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 boom. Stop, breathe, and give the player 10 seconds so they have a moment to, in their head, play out that scene, play out that turn, have that run through their mind. Just count to 10. That's all you got to do. It's not terribly difficult. Just give them 10 seconds and then move on. It gives players a little breathing time to eat a chip, take a drink of a soda, vape on their e-cig, whatever. Just give them that moment, and it allows them to kind of savor it. It gets them in the habit of being able to let their mind do a little bit of wandering and wonder what's coming up next. Now, planning, this is a very static one, and we're going to actually probably do 2 videos on that. But no matter how long you think a portion of an adventure is going to take, triple it and add 5 minutes. If you think it's going to only take a half hour, it's going to take an hour and a half plus 5 minutes. Just believe me, the players, the way everything plays out, you'd be surprised how little you have to plan and how long it takes to fulfill that little bit of plan. Mortality, this is a big one. Dungeon masters don't kill players, dice do. At any point in time when a player is risking dying, it should never be because the DM has planned that. A dungeon master should be just as surprised by a player's death as the players, and it should always be in reaction to the choices a player makes. Remember when I said the DM rolls reactions, players roll their actions? It's those rolls that should kill someone or not. You don't want to put them in inescapable solutions and things like that. Now, this goes in relation to the next one, which is players don't kill monsters, plots do. A monster should only die, in fact, for that matter, exist, because it's a matter of the plot. This is not a Japanese RPG for your council where you're wandering along and all of a sudden the world changes and there's a random encounter. Fights should have a purpose, and they should be epic. They should never be ordinary. They should never be boring. They should never be cannon fodder. Every time there's combat, there should be a real risk of death and a purpose to it. So one of the best examples in the computer world I can give you is, I believe it was Final Fantasy VIII. As you leveled up, so did everything else. And that took ordinary creatures that were easy to beat when they were low level and made them extremely difficult later on at higher levels, which is a great idea. The catch to this is that you have to craft the story such that it makes sense. If orcs are easily defeated when they're level 1, when they're level 10, they shouldn't all of a sudden magically be getting tougher. What you're either going to have to do is invent a circumstance why they're getting tougher, or move to different types of creatures for them to battle. Story is greater than the rules, and this is absolutely true because the rules are there to resolve conflict, not drive story, and the story has to come first. That's what brought the players to your table in the first place. If it was all about the rules and the mechanics, computer games are much more effective because the rules are locked in. So, be that what it may, story is always going to be more important than the rules, and suspend the rules as needed. If they're fighting an 8-hit dice creature and they're just kicking its ass and they need to be beat up for the next scene, you just keep that sucker alive and you just start kicking their ass. And you do that as best as you can for the purpose of the story. And again, this goes to the next rule. It's dead when the DM says it's dead. Part of it is trust. If a character says, I checked to make sure the orc is dead, and you say it's dead, it stays dead. Don't be a dick. And don't lie to your players, unless there's a compelling reason. If the orc has some skill or magical trinket, then it makes sense. But if the players ask you, is it dead? Yes, then it stays dead. It's that simple. But more importantly, a character should never utter this phrase, and in fact I penalize them severely if they do. How many hit points does it have left? I don't know how many hit points Mike Tyson has in a boxing match, and I sure as hell don't know how many hit points Sugar Ray Leonard had in some of his boxing matches. And when the guy goes down, they go down. You don't know, and you shouldn't know. And if you're kicking its ass and you know the game mechanics, and you're like, well, he's got 8 hit points, 8 hit dice, the most you could have is, let's say, 80 hit points. No, it doesn't work that way. That's going back to the first rule. Trust, trust, trust. If the DM is keeping the creature alive, you have to trust the DM that that's for the greater good of the story and the adventure. That's simple. And again, it comes down to never ever hurry. Role-playing is a fine wine, not a tray of shots. Now, for the kids, you will have no understanding of that, but for the adults, you will. And basically, the idea is that you shouldn't have to hurry through a role-playing game. It's not about getting to the destination, it's about the journey. And the idea of participating in a fictional world and in interacting with a fictional environment, you should be enjoying that process. If not, again, there are many computer games and television and movies that are going to be much more better suited for you. But like a good movie or a good book or a good stage play or anything that's really, really good in your mind, you don't want it to end. So why hurry? And the last bullet point is players provide the content, DMs provide the context. The bulk of a role-playing game session is provided by the players. The narrator might have to do the bulk of the narration, but basically think of it this way. If you have a story about a fight happening in an alley, that's all you provide. There's a fight, it's in an alley. The player's interaction and questions and information requests flesh that out, not you. I don't have to open up with, the alley is 128 feet long, 12 feet wide, with brick on each side. There are 27 participants in the combat in the alleyway on 2 different opposing teams. No, I don't have to do all that. There's a fight in an alley. That should prompt the players then to ask the questions to flesh that out. How many people are there? How wide is the alley? How tall is it? Who's fighting? Are there obviously identifiable sides? And so forth. So that's the key points that we're going to go over and kind of try to flesh out in this series. And again, we're hoping ultimately that that this entire series of videos that we go through will kind of help preserve some of the art and the techniques that went into this kind of stuff, on how to handle it. And we're going to get into much more practical examples when we get to the individual sections on, you know, this is how it happens and this is how it sounds and these are the differences between the 2 approaches and so forth. So with that said, I'm going to let you go. Again, hopefully the videos will be provided here, and someday, if depending on how popular they get, we'll come back over these, redo them, and put a little bit more multimedia presentation